Resourceful Designer, episode 164, Client Onboarding Part 5, the Design Contract.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, your host. His favorite season is fall. Mark Dickhout.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad that you've joined me this week, that you've plugged me in your ears, turned me on in your speaker, and are following along in this series that I'm creating on client onboarding. Now, this is part 5 of the series, and today I'm talking about the design contract, what goes into a contract, when and why you should use one, and of course other things to look out for. Now, if you haven't listened to the previous episodes of the client onboarding series, I suggest you go back to episode 160 and start there. Each episode from 160 on through this one defines a different part of the ever-important client onboarding process. And if you follow each one, you have a much better chance of landing those potential clients and turning them into paying clients. Now, also this week, I'm going to share a resource of something that'll help you to stylize emails. So what have I been up to this past week? Well, it's been a really good week for me. I've had 2 contracts signed for new website projects that I'm going to begin shortly, so I'm excited about that. I made a really nice commission on a reorder for a letterhead for one of my clients. They contacted me, said they need a reorder of their letterhead. I contacted the printer. A couple of days later, I was told the order was ready, delivered it, and got a nice hefty commission for that one. So if you want to know more about how I go about doing that, listen to episode 49 of the podcast, Print Brokering to Supplement Your Graphic Design Business. So that's kind of week that I've had so far. Now, as I said in the intro, I want to share with you a resource that can help you send out some pretty impressive emails. Now, I'll be upfront, I have not used this myself. I have played around with it, but I haven't actually used it. And this is a website called beefree.io. And it's B-E-E, as in the bumblebee, the insect, free.io. And what BeFree is it's an easy and quick way to design elegant, mobile responsive emails. And the website claims that over 1 million people have used BeFree to edit their emails. Now, it's a simple drag and drop email builder for designing mobile responsive emails. It's quick, it's easy, and you can use it absolutely free. Now, if you're using the free version, what they do at the end is they give you an HTML code that you can then download and then put into whatever email. Now, they give you instructions. If you use Gmail, this works wonderfully. You can plug it into your Gmail and send out these beautifully formatted. So instead of just text message, you can have images, you can have columns, you can have, it looks like a web page that you're emailing to people. Now, you can also incorporate these into other things such as MailChimp, but I even tried it through MacMail here, and I was able to get it to work. Now, if you are a paid member, then you can incorporate it much easier. The free plan requires you to download the HTML and then do whatever you want with it, where a paid one incorporates and sends the stuff directly. So there's a little bit of advantage to paying there, but you can get away with the free, and that's what I was toying around with. Now, this is something that one of the members of the Resourceful Designer community shared with us, and he's using it as part of his client outreach. And he says that so far, the response has been really, really good. So as I said, I haven't actually used it myself, although I have been playing with it, and I'm really impressed with it so far. So if you want to check it out, visit beefree.io. And once again, that's B as in B-E-E, like a bumblebee. And if you do test it out, let me know what you think. And speaking of the community, I would love to have you on board and be part of the Resourceful Designer community. We're having some great conversations in there, really getting to know each other, following along with our businesses, holding each other accountable for stuff, sharing things. It's so much more personable than the Facebook group or anything. It seems like everybody who's part of the community right now really wants to help each other out. And because this is a paid community, we know that everybody is serious about their design business. So if you want to check it out, head on over to resourcefuldesigner.com/community, where I have some information there and the pricing tiers that you can join at. And now, Client Onboarding Part 5, the Design Contract. Now, as I said in the intro, the design contract is the last part of the client onboarding process, although it is not the last part of this podcast series. There's going to be one more episode after this one, but I'll tell you more about that towards the end of this episode. So far, I've talked about the overall process of client onboarding. Then I broke it down into the individual components, the intro kit, the client meeting, the design proposal, and now the contract. Well, all of those previous parts of the process are geared towards trying to win over potential clients in order to get them to hire you to be their designer for their design project. Well, guess what? If you've made it to this stage, if you're at the point where the contract matters, then that means that all your previous steps were successful. Because now it's time for the contract. And the contract only comes out once the client has agreed to work with you. So good job. However, even though all your hard work has paid off and you now know that the client has agreed to work with you, this is not the point to let up. In fact, out of all the steps in the client onboarding process, your design contract is possibly the most important one because of the long-lasting implications that it covers. I shared the statistics with you last episode that 48% of designers don't use a contract. I find that number absolutely mind-blowing. Not only does a contract establish you as a professional business, but it's your protection against anything that may go wrong with a project or with a client. Have you ever been part of a design forum or a group, maybe the Facebook group, where someone mentions some sort of issue they're having with a client or on a project? What's the number one response? The very first comment that they usually receive is somebody asking, do you have a contract? It's that important. So I'm hoping that if you are one of those 48% that don't use a contract now, that you're taking notes and that you'll add a contract to your onboarding process after listening to this episode. Now, before I go any further, I do have to put out a disclaimer that I am not a lawyer, nor do I play one on this podcast. Do not take anything that I talk about here as legal advice. I do highly suggest that you either have a lawyer draft up your contract, or at least, if you come up with one on your own, have a lawyer review it so that you know that it's sound. Now, even if you don't have a budget to consult a lawyer, please get yourself some sort of contract and start using it today. Even a quickly put together contract, one that's not verified by a lawyer, is still better than having no contract at all. Then, once you are capable and you do have the means to consult a lawyer, do so. As Mike Montero, co-founder of Mule Design, said, you need a lawyer when you decide to stop being a design amateur and decide to start being a design professional. So yes, hiring a lawyer does cost money, but a good lawyer will help you make money. Now, in case you don't already have a contract and you're not sure where to start, I will include a couple of links in the show notes for this episode, which you'll be able to find at resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 164, or look in your podcast app of choice. Sometimes links are available in there if your podcast app does display them. But I'll include a link to a great open source design contract that you can use that'll allow you to draft your own contract. Again, you better have it looked at by a lawyer, but it allows you to do that. I'll also include a link to the AIGA's website where they have a good standard contract that you can also use, and that's free as well. So both those links will be in the show notes for this episode. So now that I have that part out of the way, what is a design contract? Well, unlike the design proposal that I talked about last week, which is specific to the project you're bidding on, laying out what the project aims to achieve and how you're going to go about achieving that objective, a design contract, on the other hand, follows the proposal. It comes afterwards, and it's a terms and conditions document. And it's used to define the expectations that both parties should have. A design contract should contain an overview of who is hiring you and what they are hiring you to do and for how much. It should contain the respective responsibilities of both parties, what you both agreed to. It should also contain the specifics as to what is included and what is not included in the scope of the work that you're going to be doing. It should include what happens should one of the parties change their mind about anything pertaining to the project, as well as containing an overview of whatever liabilities and other legal matters may come up. In other words, your design contract needs to cover your process, what the client can expect, what you can expect from the client, timeframes, payment details, technical details, and any other legalese that you deem fit for your contract. Everything in your contract should be explicitly stated in order to be agreed upon by both you and your client before a project can begin. Now, maybe you're thinking, if 48% of all designers, that's almost half of all designers, don't use a contract, then how can they be so important? Let me tell you, a contract is the only surefire way to protect both you and your business's interests while working with a client. So the answer is yes, you should be using a design contract for every client and every project you take on. Should any dispute arise during the course of the project, a signed contract will quickly establish if anyone is at fault and what actions, if any, should be taken to remedy the conflict. Now, with that said, you need to be reasonable. If your mom or sister or aunt wants you to design an invitation for their annual girls' poker tournament that they're hosting, you don't need to get them to sign a contract. When I designed a book cover for my brother, I didn't get him to sign a contract. To me, family and friends are exempt, at least most of the time that is. My rule of thumb is, if the person I'm doing the work for has the potential to generate money directly or indirectly through whatever it is I'm doing for them, then I get them to sign a contract. And this includes charities and nonprofits. So if a family member wants me to design something, like say my cousin Mary wants me to design something for her new baby announcement, I don't get Mary to sign a contract. But if Mary is promoting a marathon to raise awareness for some charity, some disease, some cancer or something like that, and she wants me to design the posters that'll help promote this thing, then yes, in that case, I will have a contract signed up because there's the possibility of income being generated, or not necessarily income, but at least money being generated. She might not be making any money off of it, but money is being generated for something. So anytime money is involved, a contract should be involved. You see, a contract is there to prevent problems. You want your relationship with your clients to go as smoothly as possible, don't you? Well, a contract can help you by preventing problems before they start. It protects both parties. A good contract not only protects you, but it should also protect your client as well. It also shows your importance. You want your relationship to be a partnership. A contract will help you establish this. Without one, a client may think that since they are hiring you, that then you work for them. But you don't want them to think that you work for them. You want them to think that you're working with them. By getting them to sign a contract, they'll think differently of you and realize that you are working together. Another way a contract can prevent problems is by being clear with expectations. When both you and your client understand what is expected of each of you, then the whole project usually moves more smoothly. So that's why you should be having a contract with every project you take on. But when is the good time to present a contract? Well, a great time to present one is as soon as you're done your proposal. Last week, I talked about pitching your proposal to your client. As soon as you're done that is the perfect time to present your contract while everything is still fresh in your client's mind. You can even use it as a stepping stone or some sort of launch pad to land the client. For example, you just finish your proposal. Will you say something like, well, that was my proposal for designing your new website. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm an open book. I'll answer anything you have. And if you want to move forward, if you've decided that we're the right combination, I have my contract right here. We can pull it out and we can sign it and get working on this project right away. While you have your client in that state of mind, this may be all that's needed to push them over in order for them to hire you. Now, if it's the type of project that doesn't require a proposal, like I mentioned a few last week, you can simply email your contract to the client and request them to sign and return a copy of it to you. Unlike the proposal, which you should never leave behind, the proposal should be done in person, either on the video, in person, or on the phone, and you present it to them. You never actually give it to them or leave it with them. Your contract, it's okay to leave it because they're going to want to retain a copy anyways. If you do send the contract to the client, whether by mail or email, somewhere on the contract, it should state that you will not start on a project until you have the signed contract in hand. That's very important. That way, if a client tells you, oh yeah, I signed the contract and I'm dropping it in the mail today, can you get started? No, you need the contract in hand, because some clients will tell you they've signed the contract even though they haven't. They just want you to get started, and you should not be starting on their project until you have a signed contract. As a side note, if you are going to meet a client and you're bringing your contract and you know that they're going to have their lawyer, like if this is a big client and they're going to have their lawyer present at a meeting, then you will definitely want to have a lawyer present as well. Now, if this is a really big client, I presume it's a very big project, you're going to be paid well for it. Take a little bit of that money and make sure you hire a lawyer to come along with you. You do not want to discuss a contract directly with the client's lawyer without having legal advisor on your side as well. Now, let me tell you, a great test to how good your contract is when your client is a lawyer themselves. I've mentioned before on the podcast how I have a few clients that are law firms. Well, let me tell you, that was a little bit interesting, having a conversation with them about my contract, talking with a lawyer. Now, I did not take my previous advice. I did not bring a lawyer with me to discuss this because technically I was dealing with the client and not the client's lawyer, even though they're one and the same. But that was an interesting conversation. We had some back and forth, a little bit of negotiation going on, but in the end, it all worked out really well. But it's funny to deal with a lawyer and hear their perspective on your contract, because trust me, they will dissect your contract. Now, one thing I should state here is I'm talking about your contract, the contract, but should you have one contract for all projects? The answer is no. Now, I know because it takes time to draft a contract and the cost involved with getting lawyers to look at it, it's tempting to create just one contract that covers all projects you undertake. However, this is not advisable. Yes, some parts of your contract can be reusable. In fact, most of the contract can be reused, but some sections will need to remain flexible enough to adhere to whatever scope the project has that you're taking on. For example, if you're being hired to design a logo, the contract that you provide will be very different because it's going to have copyright information and transfer of intellectual property components to it, all sorts of stuff that a contract for a website doesn't have. So the contract can't be a generic one contract fits all. It's in your best interest to have variations on the contracts for each type of design work you take on. I can tell you that I have a contract for website, I have a contract for web maintenance, I have a contract for web hosting, I have a contract for logo design or branding, I have a contract for print design, and I have a contract for print brokering. And I will use whatever contract for whatever it is I need to do. Now, in some cases, when I go meet with a client, I'll bring 3 or 4 different contracts with me and have them sign each one. And I'll tell them, this is a contract for designing your website. Once the website's done, then here's a contract for the maintenance that we're going to do. In the process of all this, here's a separate maintenance for the website hosting, because that's a separate charge on top of the website design and maintenance, and so forth and so forth. So I have them sign each contract in turn, because each one has its own specific purpose. Talking about all these contracts is great, but if you don't know what goes into the contract, it probably doesn't help you very much. So now I'm going to go over different parts of the contract. Now, again, you are going to want to consult a lawyer. You're going to want to get their advice, maybe look at different templates online to get an idea of different things that people put in, talk to other designers and find out what they have in theirs. But here's a general idea of the different sections or clauses, if you will, that should go into your design contract. First off, you need to define both parties. So the very start of the contract, you need to name yourself and or your business, your company, if you have one, as well as the client and their company. Now, be sure you also mention the individual you are dealing with. So if you are dealing with a big corporation, you may mention the corporation's name or the big company's name, but you also want to mention the individual, the person you are dealing with. After that comes the project basics, I guess, or the outline. So this is where you outline the scope of the job. Now, you don't have to go into big detail, but you're going to talk about what the job is, what you're being hired to do, and what process you will take to complete that project. Now, if you did do a client proposal, you can actually mention in your contract that the outline are this, as outlined in the project proposal, and then attach that to the contract as an addendum. At that point, it's okay for the client to get a copy of it because they're signing the contract. So at that point, it's okay for them to have a copy of the proposal. And you can use that in your contract. Now, the next section in your contract, and I'm saying next section just because this is the way I have them written down. These can be in any order. They don't have to be in the order that I'm listing them here. But the next section that I have here is the client responsibilities. Your contract should include the client's responsibilities, such as who is your contact person. You want to make sure that if you're dealing with a company, you have one person you are dealing with. That one person is the one that can give you feedback, give you advice, that can approve things or whatever. You don't want to have a general contract for the whole company and then have to deal with a whole bunch of different people. So in your contract, mention who it is you are dealing with. Also with the client responsibilities is what is expected of the client at each stage of the project. Do they need to provide content at the beginning? Do they need to provide logins and passwords if required for a website or a database or whatever? Make sure that they know that one of their responsibilities is proofreading. I have a separate clause in my own contract that states that regardless of whether they provided the copy, my copywriter provided it, or whether I wrote the copy, the client is ultimately responsible for proofreading and making sure there are no spelling or grammatical errors in the copy. I will not be held responsible should it go to print or whatever and something be found afterwards. And this includes something that they provided. And I tell them right in my contract that there's always possibility that during a copy and paste, something happens. So even if they provided proofread copy to begin with, it should still be proofread after I put the piece together. So just because they provided something that they've already proofread is not an excuse for not proofreading it afterwards. So make sure to include something like that in your contract. And the other responsibility is timeframes, stuff that the client should adhere to. Now I'm going to get more to that in a little bit. The next clause or section of the contract that I have here is the deliverables. Define what it is that you are providing to the client as well as what you are not providing them. For example, are you supplying the images and the copy for the project through you or a copywriter? Or is the client doing that? If you're not, then the client has to supply them. Also mention here whether or not you provide working files at the end of the project. Do you give a layered PDF file or layered Adobe Illustrator file, or do you only give the client the final PDF? That should be stated in your contract. You also should talk about storage and archiving of files. Once the project is done, how long do you hold on to the files? In my case, my contract states that I will keep files for 6 months. Now, that doesn't mean I delete them after 6 months. I still have files going back 15 years, but I'm only responsible for them up to 6 months. After 6 months, if I don't want to do anything, I don't have to. My contract states to the client that they have to retain copies of anything I give them. I only hold on to them for 6 months. So state that sort of thing, because you don't want a client to come back to you 10 years later and say, oh, I need a copy of that file, and then be upset or something when you say, I don't have that anymore. And on the same note, should they come back to you in the future, you may also want to mention in this section what sort of charge there would be if the client wants something. I said, I have files going back 15 years since I started my business, but some of those files are burnt onto DVD. And technically, I don't even have a DVD player for my computer anymore. So if a client wants something from one of those files, first of all, I'm going to have to find a computer with a DVD in order to copy them or purchase a DVD player for my computer. And so there may be some sort of charge in the future. If a client wants a file past that 6 months time, I may charge them for whatever. Now, the next section is your procedures, how you work. This is the section that if you offer revisions, you're going to mention how many revisions, how the revisions work. If you give multiple logos, say this is for a logo project and you design 3, you're going to give them 3 different layouts and they get the 2 revisions or whatever, how this process works and what happens after. If they want to do another set of revisions, will there be an extra charge? What will that extra charge be? Or will you just say, no, there's no more after that? So whatever procedures that you take in the building or the completion of this project should be mentioned here. Anything that the client needs to know. Now, the next section is timelines and deadlines. You should both be agreeing to a realistic timeline and deadlines for the project. including start times. So if you're going to design a website for a client, but you can't start it for a month or 2 months, make sure that's in your contract, that you will be starting the project. And you can either say 2 months time or set an actual date saying that the website will be added to your calendar on such and such a date, and make sure you follow through. So make sure that the timelines and deadlines are realistic for the project. You should also mention how long each stage of the project will probably take. Like, this will take maybe a week or 2 weeks, or you will have something to them by such and such a date and that. And then you will also have to let them know how much time they will have to review each stage of the process. So when you give a proof to the client, they don't end up holding on to it for a week or two that throws off your whole schedule. Let them know that when you give them a proof, they have 24, 48, 72 hours in order to get back to you with feedback or revisions or approval of that stage. So they know beforehand what they have to do. Now be sure in this section or it's somewhere in the contract to remind them again of your contact schedule and contact methods. You already gave them this in your design kit and as well during your client meeting. And at all stages, I believe you gave them this information, but make sure it's in your contract that if you only want to deal with them during certain hours of the day, certain business hours, that's in your contract, that they can reach out to you during those times. Now, the next section I have is, of course, the ever important payment details and terms. Your contract has to state what you are to be paid for the project, when you are to be paid for the project, how you are to be paid for the project. You should also mention any penalties should late payments occur or anything else come up, as well as whatever cost may be involved for additional work outside the scope of the defined project. I mentioned earlier, if you do revisions and you offer 2 revisions and the client wants 3, 4, 5 revisions, how much extra would those be? You mentioned that under payment details and terms. You can also mention if there's a certain thing you're doing here and maybe outside the project window, if you bill by the hour, you can say additional work will be billed at, and then mention your hourly rate. So payment details, of course, very important information. It's one of the things the client's definitely going to want to check out. So make sure it's well defined. Now, another section that you can include in your contract is a confidentiality and an NDR. Because of the nature of most design projects and how we are privy to information before it becomes public, it's a good idea to state in your contract that all sensitive information provided to either party or to your third parties, if you have contractors, that all of that will remain confidential. You can also state your willingness to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I would not include a non-disclosure agreement in the contract itself. I would only state that should the client want to provide one, you would be willing to sign it. And then it's totally up to the client whether they want to or not. Now, the next section here is intellectual property. Now, I hope you know that as a designer, you automatically own the rights to anything that you create. And as such, only you can determine how and when you can transfer those rights. Whenever you're working on a project, there comes a time where you may have to transfer intellectual property rights over to the client. Well, state in your contract what is included and what isn't in that transfer process. Does the process happen after the final payment? It shouldn't happen before the final payment. That's just my opinion, but make sure you state that in your contract so the client knows that they don't own the intellectual property until after final payment has been received. Now, what if it's a case that you ask for payment in advance? Then specify when that will happen, when the intellectual property will turn over. Is it once you receive the approval? Is it a week after, a month after, whatever the case? So you need to specify at what point in the whole process does the intellectual property become the property of the client. If you are licensing the intellectual property to the client, you should state here what are your terms. Now, I'm not going to get into licensing intellectual properties. That's a whole other ballgame here. But if that's something you do, make sure you list your terms for licensing on your contract. Now, along the same lines of intellectual property is promotion and credit. make sure, and this is important, make sure you have a section in your contract that states that you have the ability to promote and share the work that you create, including anything that has the intellectual property signed over to the client. You need to have an allowance in your contract that allows you to use your work for self-promotion, stuff like your portfolio or just showing it to other people, as well as being able to submit your work for competitions or for display. Now, you also should include any information for the client to properly credit you for your hard work in case they ever need to. Include the exact language to use when crediting you in, say, a press release. If they want to do a press release about their brand new rebrand or something like that, that they need to mention you by name and exactly how you want them to mention you. Do you want you to be named as a designer, or do you want your business to be named as the creator? Specify to the client exactly how they're supposed to name you. And that's for stuff like press releases or awards or competitions. I designed a book cover for the directory for my local Chamber of Commerce years ago. And I found out after this had all taken place that the book had actually won a national contest for the best cover for a book design. I didn't submit it, the client had. And they wanted to let me know that it had won. And when I checked, yes, I was credited for designing that cover. And that was because I included it in my contract and the client adhered to that. And I could claim that I won an award for that design cover, even though I never submitted it. So make sure you cover yourself for any sort of promotion or credit that you get for the work you create. Now, another important part of the contract is a cancellation policy. What happens if you or the client needs to end the project for whatever reason? Now, I'm not going to get into details on what some of those reasons would be, but let's just say one of you has to end the contract early. What happens to any payments received or pending? If you have to cancel the contract, are you going to return any money? If the client decides to cancel the contract, are they due any money back, or do you keep anything without refunding? Are there different cancellation policies for different stages of the project? What happens if the client cancels after seeing your initial concepts, or if they cancel right before signing off on the final project? What happens at different stages? So you need to have a cancellation policy. Now, along the same lines, although this is a separate clause in your contract, is force majeure, also known as acts of God. And this should be included in all contracts. And what this states is you need to specify what should happen if any unforeseen situation, something beyond your control, makes you unable to complete the project. And that could be anything from you got broken into and all your equipment was stolen, to your house was flooded or burnt down in a fire, or a family member died, or you got hit by a car, or anything, whatever it is, something that's beyond your control. If that should happen and you cannot complete the project, what happens at that stage? Now, the first step should not be just to cancel and refund money and all that. Maybe you can have that we can negotiate and see maybe the time frame can be changed. If you had told the client that you'd have the project done within a month and something comes up, find out if you can tack on a couple of extra weeks to the contract and finish it a little bit later. Client may be okay with that. Find out if you do have contractors that are helping you, if one of them can take over the project and finish it on your behalf. Or it may be a matter of just figuring out if something happens, then you may have to hand over everything, all the work done to date. And at that stage, the client will only owe you for a certain amount of time or whatever. So it's always a good idea to have something. Now, I hope you never have to use it, but it's always a good idea to have it in your contract. Now, next is a liability clause. This is just something to make sure that you cover yourself should something go wrong down the line. You don't want to be held responsible for any problems down the road. And this could be anything such as, who knows, maybe a year or two down the road, the client gets sued for something. Well, you don't want stuff to come back on you. I'll give you an example. One of my clients' websites, I'm hosting the website. I manage the website for them, but they have a blog that they upload to. And in one of the blog posts, they took an image. They did a Google search, found an image, put it on their blog post, and it was an image that came from Getty Images, but they had not purchased it. Well, Getty contacted me with a hefty price tag for copyright infringement on that. Well, I have a contract with the client saying I'm not liable for anything that happens like that. So I just contacted the client and said, hey, you have to deal with this. And the client ended up, they negotiated a fee with Getty, but they had to pay a couple of $1,000s and remove the image from their site. But I was able to turn to the client. Now, in that case, the client knew that it was their responsibility. They had done it. It's not something I had added to the site, but Getty had come to me. And if Getty had pursued the matter further with me, I had a contract stating that I am not liable for any of the information or anything happens in the future on that website. Now, speaking of liabilities and all that, another section you should have on your contract is stating your legal jurisdiction and legal fees. This is to help you out should you ever have to enforce anything in the contract in the future, maybe take the client to small claims court if they don't pay you or anything like that. You need to state that all legal proceedings, anything you do if you take the court, will take place in your local jurisdiction. If you don't, then the client could say, sure, you can take me to court, but you have to do it wherever I am. And if they're in a different province, a different state, a different country, that can cause a lot of problems. So you have to state in your contract that any and all legal disputes will take place, or the proceedings will take place in your local jurisdiction, as well as any legal fees that are incurred are the responsibility of the client. So should you have to go to court or anything like that, the client will be responsible for any legal fees. And the next section here, this is something I actually don't have this in my contract. I just heard about this recently, but it sounded really interesting. And at one point, I wish I did have this in my contract, and that's a personal guarantee. Now, from what I've heard, this section will often, if somebody reads through the contract, this is a section of the contract that a lot of clients will ask to have removed, and for good reason. But if they don't, then it's an extra insurance on your part should something happen. Now, what a personal guarantee does is it covers you. Should there be any dispute with the company, say the company decides not to pay you, or worse, the company decides to declare bankruptcy, well, then you can legally go after the individual that signed the contract. So say you're doing some work for, I don't know, a local plumber or electrician or somebody, and you're going to design a website. Well, if you have this in there and you design a website for them, you get the whole thing done, and then they decide, no, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pay you. Or worse, they say, well, I can't pay you. I declared bankruptcy. There's no money left to pay you. In most cases, if that's the case, then you're out of luck. You can't go after somebody who's bankrupt. But if they sign this with the personal guarantee in it, then you couldn't go after the individual. Even though the company declared bankruptcy, you can go after the individual for the money. Now, I wish I had this years ago. Actually, this was shortly after I started. I had a client that I was doing regular work for. He was a screen printer and embroiderer, and I would often design stuff for him or just digitize stuff. When somebody would come in, I would scan and digitize and clean up for him. And I was doing a couple of projects a month, 2 or 3 projects a month for him. At one point, he was starting to get a little bit behind in payments, and I went after him. I says, listen, you're falling behind on payments. Can you please pay up? And I had said at that point that I wasn't going to do any more work until I got paid. He was a nice guy. I mean, I'd been working with him for a bit, and he sent me a check, and he says, Mark, here's a check, but can you hold off until next week to cash it? And I didn't think anything of it. I received the check. Great, no problem. I held off, and he told me to not, I think it was like, wait till Wednesday to cash it. Well, on the Tuesday, he called me to let me know that, sorry, Mark, but I declared bankruptcy, so you're not going to get paid. Now, the crux of this is he immediately started up a brand new business doing the exact same thing under a completely new name. So he never slowed down. His clients never knew the difference. All he did is, what he did with his name was, the company was something like John Screen Printing, established 1999 or something like that. Well, he changed the name to John's Screen Printing, established 2005. He changed the established date in the name. And that was his way around it. So technically, the old company didn't exist anymore, so I couldn't go after them legally. And he kept on running. Now, I did not do any more work for him. I refused to do any work for him at that point. But if I would have had a personal guarantee in the contract, then I could have gone after him as an individual to get my money back. So that was the very first client that I had that I failed to collect on. I've only had 3 clients in my 15 years that I failed to collect on, and that was the very first one. But as I said, the personal guarantee is usually the section that people will want removed because they don't want to be held responsible should something happen, especially if they're not the owner of the company, like say they're the manager or CEO or something like that. They don't want to be held personally responsible should something happen if it's not actually their company. So most people will ask for that section to be removed, in which case you just do. And of course, the final section of a contract is the signatures. Now, some may say this is the most crucial part of the contract. It's the part where both parties agree to the terms within. So by signing the contract, they are making it legally binding. So very important that not only does the client get the contract and read the contract, but that they actually sign the contract and that you get a copy of a signed contract from them. So those are different sections that go into a contract. Depending on the template you look at, there may be other things, or some templates don't have all of these sections. I just wanted to be thorough to make sure that you had an understanding of what should be going in. Now, things that could go wrong, even though I hope it never comes to this for you, should there ever be a situation with a client turning ugly, your contract is what will protect you. A good design contract will allow you to quickly and easily sort things out and possibly salvage the relationship with your client. Should any disputes arise, get on the phone, or better yet, go meet the client in person. Talking directly to the client can often de-escalate a situation before it becomes a big mess. Calmly remind them of the terms of your contract and what they agreed to and what is expected of them and of yourself, and hopefully solve the situation. Now, not reading or not understanding something within the contract is not an excuse that holds up, especially once the client has signed the contract. So if they come back to you and say, well, I didn't realize that, or it doesn't matter. If they sign the contract, it's in the contract. And finally, if you can't solve an issue through conversation with the client, get your lawyer involved. It's their job to handle this sort of thing. You don't need the stress. You take your time and you concentrate it on the next client, on the other people, and let the lawyers handle this one. It's not worth the headache on your part. Now, before I wrap up, I just want to give you a few key reminders when it comes to contracts. You need to remember that your contract has to fit your own workflow and policies. Yes, you can find pre-made contracts online, but you need to alter them to apply to your own personal needs. Now, I'm going to iterate here again. Find yourself a lawyer. I've mentioned it, but it merits saying again. You should really consult a lawyer about your contract. Yes, it is cheaper if you find a template online, craft your own contract, and then have it reviewed by a lawyer, and that's okay. It's cheaper to do it that way than to have a lawyer write it up from scratch. But either way, you should have a contract reviewed by a lawyer. That way you know that it's a legitimate contract. Because just finding a contract online and starting to use it, it may be fine for whatever jurisdiction it was written in, but you don't know if it actually does hold water in your area where you live. There may be something legal about it that doesn't work with your legal system depending on where you live. Now, another thing to remember is that a contract is ever evolving. It's a growing thing. You should always be improving it by adding details from each experience you face. If you run into difficulty with one client or some situation arises, alter your contract to prevent it from happening again in the future. You should be constantly changing your contract. Now, next is let your client read the contract. Yes, you want to present your proposal, but let the client read the contract on their own. Even if you're there, let them read through it. You can offer to answer any questions they have pertaining to it, but allow them to absorb it at their own pace without any pressure from you. Now, as I said, the contract is ever evolving, but it also needs to be as detailed as it needs to be. It's okay to have a long contract. Yes, your design proposal should be short, but your contract can be as long as it needs to be. The more you cover, the more you protect yourself. So it's okay if your contract is 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 pages long as whatever's in it is important and it protects yourself. And finally, remember that contracts are negotiable. It's okay to negotiate terms for your contract with a client. They may want some things change. Maybe the client doesn't want to pay 50% upfront of your fee. Maybe they only want to pay 40%. When they come back to you with changes or suggestions or a negotiation, it's up to you to decide whether or not it is worth following through. Just keep in mind that whatever new negotiated terms benefit you as well. So there you have it, design contracts. This is the final part of the client onboarding process. Now, as I stated at the beginning, the contract may be the final stage, but it's not actually the final part of this podcast series. Next week, I'm going to finish off the series with client offboarding. It's not part of the onboarding process, but it kind of goes hand in hand and is very important in solidifying your client relationship. So I hope you'll join me for that one. In the meantime, I would love to know if you use a design contract and how has it benefited you? Have you ever had to enforce a contract? Please let me know by leaving a comment for this episode by visiting resourcefuldesigner.com/episode 164. Now, this episode is already running a little bit long, so I'm going to forego the question of the week this week. But if you do have a question you'd like me to answer in a future episode of the podcast, please visit resourcefuldesigner.com/feedback and submit your question there. So thank you very much for listening. This is a bit longer one, but very important. Contracts are such a big deal, and it's a shame that 48% of designers are not using them. They really should. They solve a lot of problems, and they're really there for the benefit of us, protecting us and our business. So if you are not using a contract, please visit some of the links in the show notes that I have where you can get something to at least start a basis in order to get a contract going. So that's it for this episode. I am Mark Decote, wishing you all the best with your graphic design business and reminding you to stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer Podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.